Good evening and welcome to the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. My name is Terje Låndal and I'm the Vice President of the Academy and Chair of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences. The Academy Lecture in the Humanities and Social Sciences was established in 2009. Professor Josiah Ober from the Department of Classics at Stanford University held the first lecture. He talked about democracy and dignity. The annual lecture was established in the context of the Abel Prize and the Kavli Prizes in order to solidify the importance and relevance of the humanities and social sciences within the Academy. Since then, the lecture has been a yearly event and we've had people from all over the world giving the lecture. In 2019, we hosted Odd Arne Westad, Yale University, and in 2021, Stephen Gardner from the University of Washington in Seattle spoke to us about climate change from a philosophical perspective. This year, we have been extremely lucky to get Professor Simon Critchley to give the lecture. To introduce Professor Critchley, I would like to introduce our Vice Chair of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Emeritus Ellen Mortensen. Please, Ellen.
Thank you, Terje. I'm extremely pleased and honored to introduce the speaker of this year's Academy Lecture in the Humanities, Professor Simon Critchley, whom I'm also happy to call my friend. Simon Critchley is the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. His work engages in diverse areas: continental philosophy, philosophy and literature, psychoanalysis, ethics, and political theory, among others. Originally from the United Kingdom, Professor Critchley moved from the University of Essex in Britain to the United States in 2004, when he was offered a position at the New School in New York. Professor Critchley entered the international academic scene with the publication of The Ethics of Deconstruction, Derrida and Levinas in 1992. The book was immensely successful and projected him into an arena of international academic stars, and he was invited to give talks all over the US and Europe. Important publications have followed at regular intervals ever since. To date, Professor Critchley has published 34 books and edited four renowned book series. His publications span over an impressive range of topics, from continental philosophers like Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, and Laclau, Greek tragedy, soccer, or football as we call it, humor, David Bowie, and suicide, to mention a few. Also worth mentioning are books such as his work on Samuel Beckett, called Very Little, Almost Nothing, Death, Philosophy, Literature from 1997, a book on poetry and philosophy entitled Things Merely Are, Philosophy in the Poetry of Wallace Stevens from 2005, as well as Infinitely Demanding, Ethics of Commitment, Politics of Resistance from 2007, the Book of Dead Philosophers from 2009, and The Faith of the Faithless from 2012. Recent works include a novella, Memory Theater from 2014, as well as a book-length essay, Notes on Suicide from 2015, an ABC of Impossibility from the same year, as well as Tragedy, The Greeks and Us from 2019. Apply-Degger, a video guide to reading Heidegger's Being and Time from 2020, features on Onassis' channel. His most recent book is Bald from 2021. In addition to his academic work, Simon Critchley was series moderator of The Stone, a philosophy column in the New York Times, and co-editor of The Stone Reader in 2016. He is also 50% of an obscure musical combo called Critchley and Simmons. Today's lecture draws upon book material that Professor Critchley is currently working on and is simply called Mysticism. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Terje and to Paul and to you all for coming. And I'm very honoured to be invited to speak to you. And I'm going to get straight into it. Before I get straight into it, I'll show you where I am, because it's quite exotic as we're in the era of kind of the, this Zoom era. I'm in the Midtown Manhattan, and this is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And down there, just by chance, there's a whole kind of group of young men in tuxedos. Something's going to happen. Rockefeller Center is just over there. It's a lovely sunny day in New York, a crisp, clear, sunny day. And what I'm going to do is screen share so you can see exactly what I'm up to. And I'm going to start doing that now. And then I'll read and speak. It shouldn't take that long, about 40 minutes. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions. So let me do screen share. Let me find it. And there it is. And there it is. So, lecture, extracted from an ongoing, very nearly finished book, a full draft completed by Christmas. I finished it before Christmas, and then I have this strange process that happens when I finish something where I have to kind of walk away from it for months and months. I'm going back. So this has been very helpful to me to kind of just see what I was up to when I was writing this last year. So give you an idea of the shape of the book, and then we're going to go into something specific. The first part, chapter 1, just 2 chapters. The first chapter is on the definition of mysticism. There's a very important theologian called Bernard McGinn, who I learned a lot from. And and the other key figure there is William James. For me, the exemplar of what a philosopher can be. And he wrote about mysticism in his varieties of religious experience. Then there's the bit that I'll be reading today, the 7 adverbs that God loveth, which we'll come to. And then it leads into, to give you an idea of how this fits in, it leads into a part on the question of love and negation. I'll explain what that means. And it deals with someone I've been wanting to write about since I was an undergraduate, who's Meister Eckhart, and some of the radical sermons of Meister Eckhart. And then the second part deals with a number of authors, and it's about the question between writing and the self, and what it is for a self to try and do away with itself in writing, to write in relationship to something larger. And the first one is Anne Carson. And then the hero or the heroine of the book is Julian of Norwich, who I've been wanting to write about for many years. So it's a long philosophical account of Julian of Norwich's work. And then an American writer called Annie Dillard. You notice that many of the authors here are women. Mysticism is something where both the original text and the scholarship is, in many ways, there's a huge preponderance of female writers. Is also one of the points I'm trying to make in the book. And then I end up, the end of chapter 2, trying to engage with T.S. Eliot, who's kind of where things began for me when I was starting to read and study. And I've never really sorted out my relationship to T.S. Eliot, and in particular 4 quartets, and that's there. And then the end of this book, and this is going to be tidied up, I look at mysticism in relationship to questions of ritual in anthropology, how mysticism reframes the whole question of philosophy, how we might think about philosophy, and how mysticism survives in modern aesthetic experience. And lots of examples there. And I end up talking about music, and not any music, but popular music, the music that I love. And I'm talking about krautrock and someone called Julian Cope, who used to have a band called The Teardrop Explodes from Liverpool. And I end up with an affirmation, a defense of what I call idiot glee, and music and the Jesus idea, which is, for those of you who are Nick Cave fans, you'll see there's a lot of Nick Cave in there. So I end up with music, but this is where we begin. And this bit here might go, but this is how I began it. Once upon a time, there was a plague. Fearing disease and death, people led a hermit-like existence, distanced from each other in their domestic cells, advancing masked against a contaminated and untrustworthy reality defined by pestilence, pain, and suffering. They were suddenly aware of living in a world of contagion and possibly being contagious themselves. They followed a practice that the ancients called anachoresis, a retreat from the world, a withdrawal into solitude. Some of them, the richer ones, fled their cities for the apparent safety of the countryside. The poorer ones stayed put, hoping for the best while fearing the worst. Cut off from their compulsory commutes and their mind-numbing round of distraction from distraction by distraction, they heard silence or something close to it, sometimes punctuated by birdsong. That was very much the case in New York. You heard birds. Whether they liked it or not, they all became anchorites or anchoresses. They became unwitting mystics. There was a strange asceticism to the world of isolation and disease experienced by these people, which opened them up to extreme experiences of doubt, dereliction, dreams, hypochondria, and hallucination. Many of them felt a desperate desire for the touch of love, for a connection with something or someone outside or larger than the self, however that might be understood, possibly even as something divine. Their intense and confused feelings seem to have echoes with practices and beliefs long considered outdated, superstitious, irrational, and frankly embarrassing. It was as if something archaic, elemental, primeval, and long dead, awakened in the plague. Some of them began to wonder about the nature of these archaic feelings and how they might understand the mysticism that had revived, like some unbidden ghost. So that's kind of the setup, and then we're going to go into the part. So in the middle of chapter 1, and so this is the bit that I picked out. So here we go. I think I'm temperamentally a mystic. I feel very drawn to this form of experience and this mode of conceptualizing, and in particular, the deepening and layering of concepts with experience and experience with concepts that can be seen in mystical traditions. Skepticism is not an instinctual or default response for me. If someone tells me something, I'm inclined to believe it, no matter how strange it sounds. Maybe I'm just gullible, particularly when it comes to profound experience that I've never really had or never had in the way that I'd really like. Maybe I'm just a bad philosopher. The thoughts have certainly crossed my mind. For example, I believe that Julian of Norwich had shewings or revelations of Christ, that George Fox, founder of the Quakers, was carried up to heaven, that William Blake was visited by angels in his dark little dwelling off the Strand in London, that Wordsworth had a total sensuous apprehension of the divine in nature during his ascent of Mount Snowdon, and that Philip K. Dick had an intellectual intuition of the divine in February 1974. This list could be continued. In fact, it could be nicely endless. I don't doubt these things, at least not at first. And I sometimes wonder whether I, as someone who teaches philosophy as a day job, should always be cultivating skepticism or praising the power of critical thinking. There is a defensive myopia to the obsession with critique, a refusal to see what you can't make sense of, blocking the view of any strange new phenomenon with a misty drizzle of passive-aggressive questions. At this point in history, it's at least arguable that understanding is as important as critique, and patient, kind-hearted, sympathetic observation more helpful than endless personal opinions, as we live in a world entirely saturated by suspicion and fueled by vicious judgments of each other. I'm not arguing for dogmatism, but I sometimes wonder whether philosophy's obsession with critique risks becoming a form of obsessional self-protection against strange and novel forms of experience. Evelyn Underhill, kind of been forgotten now, very important figure in the early 20th century, who did so much to popularize mysticism in the early 20th century, defines it as experience in its most intense form. Shouldn't one at least try to have a taste of this intensity? Mysticism is not primarily a theoretical issue. It's existential and practical. It is, and this can serve as a sort of definition, the cultivation of practices which allow you to free yourself from your standard habits, your usual fancies and imaginings, and see what is there and stand with what is there, ecstatically. My background concern is with this question of ecstasy. My background concern is both with the poverty of contemporary experience and how that misery can be transformed with the wealth of words and sounds that might permit us to push back against the pressure of reality and allow a richness of life and a possible transfiguration of self and world. This is the possibility of something like ecstasy, not as an altered state, but as this state intensified, elevated, deepened. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm powerfully drawn to the way that mystics experience what they experience and then think, speak, and write about that experience. But it can be quite hard to describe, particularly to skeptical eyes who might see mystics as simply crazy, which in a sense they are, mad with God, whichever God that might be. So I've decided to frame my approach to mysticism around 7 adverbs that might get us closer to seeing the phenomenon. For, as the old saying goes, an old Protestant saying, as I'm aware, God loveth adverbs. Mystics can be said to think and work in the following 7 adverbial ways. So rather than say what is mysticism, let's look at adverbs that describe what they're up to. These 7 adverbs are obliquely, autobiographically, vernacularly, performatively, practically, erotically, and ascetically. Let's take those in turn. That's going to be the scope of the talk. Adverb 1, obliquely. That is to say enigmatically, negatively, through unsaying, oxymorons, antitheses, paradoxes, exaggerations, and subtractions. The writer of the mystical theology, who's known to us as Dionysius, and very possibly Syriac, is the progenitor of apophatic or negative theology. He writes excessively of the super-essential darkness, or darkness beyond radiance, to describe God. The anonymous but Dionysius-inspired and Dionysius-translating late 14th century author of an English text called The Cloud of Unknowing writes, of God himself can no man think. The Cloud author's English translation of the mystical theology is simply and beautifully called hid divinity, hidden divinity. If God is hidden, then God has to be approached obliquely, negatively. God transcends all affirmation. You find this all over this tradition. It is the indirection of much mystical writing that interests me. Maybe indirection is the best direction to take in writing. What we can see in so many mystical texts, to borrow from my friend Eugene Thacker, is a logic and a poetics. This is a logic of saying and not saying, a non-negative negation, a series of what we might call ascending negations, which is a way of approaching or adumbrating what St. John Chrysostom calls the incomprehensibility of God, or the cloud of unknowing that separates us from the divine. Mystical logic with respect to God is not a series of descending affirmations from some postulation of God or substance down through some purported chain of being to angels and humans, animals and stones. It's rather a series of ascending negations, moving up from here below, obliquely and superlatively, putting a cloud of forgetting between us and all creatures and peering up through a cloud of unknowing. The logic of negation is also a poetics, a very interesting poetics that places emphasis on a series of figures like darkness, the desert, cloud, mist, sea, shadow, abyss, radiance, and the whole palette of colors that can be seen in my favored mystic, Julian of Norwich. Here, the intellectual insight into God is conceived on analogy with empirical sight. It's a multiplying of vision from the perceptual to the conceptual. What's particularly interesting here are the climatological motifs in the poetics of mysticism. There is a conceptual environmentalism within mysticism, but this is not merely or simply empirical, but also conceptual, where concepts endlessly enrich and enliven experience. So the second adverb, autobiographically. The birth of autobiography, especially female autobiography, occurs with mystical writing. The I in Julian is the first I of an Englishwoman. The second is Marjorie Kemp, a generation later than Julian, They met in 1413. Marjorie wanted the counsel of Dame Julian, as she called her. The earliest women's lives we possess are in many cases the lives of the mystics. Sometimes these lives will be written directly by the mystic, as with Julian, Marguerite Porete, or Teresa of Avila. Sometimes they'll be recorded by a brother scribe, as with Angela Foligno, Christina of Marquiate, Christine the Astonishing, and many others. This autobiographical tradition begins a lot earlier and in a different mode with St. Augustine. Augustine and his mother, Santa Monica, have a fleeting vision and reach out and touch what they see as the eternal wisdom of the Lord. This is the vision at Ostia in Book 9 of the Confessions. But the autobiographical tradition developed significantly in the medieval period, taking on some remarkably novel gender inversions along the way. That's something that's important to this project for me. For example, there's a 14th century text called the Sister Catherine Treatise, apocryphally attributed to Meister Eckhart, certainly deeply influenced by his metaphysics of flow and his radical theology of the Godhead. But this text is a dialogue between a young woman or daughter and her confessor or father. The dialogue begins with the father instructing the daughter, but ends the other way around, with the daughter becoming the father's teacher after she's gone through a period of exile, which culminates with the extraordinary experience of self-deification. She says, "Father, rejoice with me, I have become God." It's also not simply the case that Brother Scribe is documenting the mystical ecstasies of an illiterate woman. Henry Suso's remarkable autobiography, The Life of the Servant, which was hugely popular, hugely well read, the first such book in German, only exists because it was written by his spiritual daughter, Suso's disciple and novice, Elspeth Stagel, or Stegel. Importantly, if there is a discovery of the autobiographical I in mystical writing, then it has the structure of I as an other, as Rambo said. The I finds its voice and itself through its relation to the otherness of God. Maybe this is why autobiographies without God are so often dull. One thinks of the contemporary tyranny of memoir, unless they stage autobiography as the self's conflictual, dialectical relation to itself, a division within the self which inhabits the form of the religious narrative. I'm thinking here of the way in which Rousseau's Confessions takes over the structure from Augustine. We could say more about Rousseau, and again, Nietzsche would be Nietzsche's stunning self-presentation in his 1886 prefaces and in Ecce Homo, where Nietzsche is always doubled, at war with himself. Autobiographies without an I as another structure are doomed to dullness unless extraordinary things have happened to you. Adverb 3, vernacularly. That is in the local spoken language, often by unlettered women. In the case of Julian, she uses that word, unlettered, which probably meant that she didn't know Latin and wasn't literatus. But other mystics like Angela Foligno in the 13th century were probably entirely illiterate and relied on Brother Scribe, a devoted monk. Julian's book is the first book in English by an Englishwoman, but the same is true of Hadewig of Antwerp in Middle Dutch, Porete in Old French, Mechtild of Magdeburg in Middle Low German, and Eckhart's sermons in Middle High German. Medieval mysticism, especially in Northern Europe, it's also the case in Scandinavia a bit later, is the discovery of vernacular as a religious language. Of course, the use of the vernacular is an implicit challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church and its use of Latin. One can see this in England with John Wycliffe and the Lollards and the rise of what is called Lollardy and their insistence on the use of the translated Bible from the 14th century onwards, which is linked to popular insurgency against the powers of church, king, and state, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And one of the prime causes of the revolt was a pandemic, namely the Black Death. Mysticism is often linked to what emerges in the Reformation in the early 16th century with Luther, who also translates the Bible into German. Luther is anti-mystical, committed to the alien nature of grace, as opposed to the so-called enthusiasts of the Reformation, like Thomas Müntzer and the Anabaptists, who stressed the immanence of God in every person. And this leads to all those wars in the 16th century in the German-speaking lands. Although this is a much more complex issue than I'm allowing here, which requires considerable historical nuance, the Reformation opens a different space for mysticism, where the turn to the vernacular permits a democratization of religious institutions and a progressive laicization, an undermining of clerical power, which could be traced with a particularly wild intensity in America, in groups like the Quakers, the Shakers, the Baptists, and the Mormons, even all the way to Scientology. Adverb 4, performatively. We can approach this issue by following Michel de Certeau, who is an interesting fellow, both a Jesuit priest and a psychoanalyst. Although de Certeau was, amongst other things, a scholar of early modern French mysticism, I want to take literally there's an epigraph to this chapter where de Certeau says the way to approach mysticism is as a savage in the kitchen. That's what I'm alluding to here. Maybe we need to approach mysticism with a little kitchen-esque savagery. Okay. For de Certeau, this is the important point. Mysticism is not a domain of knowledge or a series of texts whose truth is evidenced with reference to some exterior reality, like the substantiality of God, or simply authorized through an appeal to experience. On the contrary, mysticism is a style, a set of practices, a way of speaking and acting which are self-authorizing. Mysticism is performative. It's a certain form of writing and speaking which does not just record experience, but which produces experience. An experience that might be unlived, but is not necessarily unloved. I've got lots more to say about this, but I want to get through it fast. But mystical writing, this is de Certeau's point, is a heterology, where the presence of the speaker as subject is an effect of utterance made possible through the other speaking through the subject, where that other is usually God. I is another is a basic mode of production for mystical texts. Mysticism is a heterology where God and the I become one, or as McGinn says of Meister Eckhart, God and the I enter into a zone of indistinction. This is a lack of distinction in the I and God, which is premised upon the annihilation of the soul, the strangely passive activity of decreation. That's a big theme in the book, decreation. We'll see if we come back to that. Adverb 5, practically. The point about the performative dimension of mysticism can be put differently. And this is at the core of the Amy Hollywood, who's a very interesting theologian teaching at Harvard now. Amy Hollywood's understanding of mysticism as it develops within monasticism. She rightly views mysticism as it develops in relation to rigorous religious practices, specifically the practices of reading of scripture, preaching, and participation in liturgy, especially the recitation of the Psalms. Importantly, these practices of reading, meditation, prayer, composition, and contemplation are both spiritual and physical practices. As Hollywood writes, the Benedictine's life is one in which the monk or nun strives to make every actual action a ritual action. Mysticism has to be understood in relation to the cultivation of such practices. Perhaps such practices are the best that we can hope for when the world has fallen to pieces. I return to the question of ritual and devotional practice later in the book. Another very, very simple way of putting this point is that mysticism is not some noetic or intellectual activity. It's not some state of belief or non-belief, or even some theoretical apprehension of the divine. Rather, mysticism is a practical matter, a matter of organizing one's life around a set of practices which are ritually organized. And this is a point that Evelyn Underhill makes very much against William James in her book, Practical Mysticism and Elsewhere. She rather charmingly addresses throughout the practical man, the man on the Clapham omnibus. Mysticism is not a question of theoretical knowledge or even focused on the interiority of the self. It's about doing, about the repetition of deeds, indeed of work and good works. It's about living according to a rule, however that might be understood. And this is the meaning of asceticism. Asceticism, ascesis, is sometimes translated into Latin as studium, which is both spiritual and bodily. This is what it means to study, to be a student, namely to become ascetic. Yes, when we ask people to become students, or when they become students, they become ascetic. If it ceases to mean that, then I do not know what study means. When one's life has become practically and performatively ritualized in accordance with a rule, then that experience that we call mystical might happen. It also might not. Here's a provisional thought. One can link the theme of practice to the origins of monasticism in St. Anthony in the Desert Fathers. This is the 3rd, 4th century of the Christian era. One of the most widely read books in the history of Christendom, much more widely read than Plato or Aristotle, was Athanasius's Life of Antony, 373. And it was a kind of rewriting of Plato's Apology, where Socrates becomes Antony, the philosopher becomes the monk. Antony engages in a withdrawal or retreat from the city, in this case, Alexandria. And Alexandria was the Manhattan of the ancient world, a commercial island city off the coast of a vast continent, set up by foreign colonial powers with a voracious appetite for everything. Antony withdraws from Alexandria and goes first into the necropolis of the city, and from there into the desert. Here, the desert is seen as a temple without walls. This is anachoresis, a retreat into solitude where the monk is the monos, the solitary. The idea is that one can find God in the desert by withdrawing into a cave or into a cell. A cave is a cell. The desert is a kind of mystical laboratory where one can find God, a figure which is retained in changed form in the idea of the hermitage and the anchor hold in, say, Northern Europe. The point is that withdrawal is a practice. And obviously I'm thinking about that in the fact that we've been engaged in a process of withdrawal. In the Desert Fathers, the fruit of withdrawal can be hesychia, quiet, stillness, silence, and the cultivation of apatheia, passionlessness or equanimity, disinterestedness, to become a corpse, to become dead to the world. The monk is dead to the world. One has to struggle with Acadia, the noonday demon, or listlessness and sloth, such as what we call depression, which Julian calls in Middle English, it's a lovely phrase, heaviness, right? Heaviness with which the self is attached to itself, riveted to itself. It's only through Acadia that God can be felt, heard, communicated with. This is an important point for the tradition that I'm trying to deal with. It's only through dereliction and despair that one might engage in the straining forward into God. It's only through listlessness that one might both listen to and lust for God. Both these senses are present in Middle English, list, which recurs in the Cloud of Unknowing. And it's there also in Hamlet when he says to the ghost, "Oh, list, list, oh, list." Listening isn't just passive, it signifies a lust, a desire. In place of the imprisoned philosopher, Socrates, we find the figure of the monk running to his prison cell. Remember the advice of the elderly desert monk to the doubting novice: go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Adverb 6, erotically. I want to say a little bit more about this adverb. My interest in mysticism is a move towards what we can call a historicization of philosophical discourse, as opposed to philosophies. This is where my anger at my own discipline comes out, as opposed to philosophy's typical anti-enthusiastic, anti-visionary, obsessional, neurotic rationalism. This can be better understood as transforming philosophy from a love of wisdom into a love of wisdom, or the wisdom of love. In order to list to God, we must both listen to and lust for the divine. On this point, not on all points, but on this point, Jacques Lacan has something to say. What's at stake for Lacan is the possibility of a lust, an enjoyment that is other than phallic. That's the way he puts it. What Lacan calls an other jouissance, a feminine jouissance, something en plus, something more, something transgressive. It's fascinating that mystics place an important emphasis upon the enjoyment of God, Right? It's not a question of belief in God, it's a question of the enjoyment of God. Marie of the Incarnation, a French missionary in Quebec, in Canada, wrote, "God alone was my only enjoyment." God is spiritually and physically enjoyed, which is why Christ is so important, why the incarnation is so vital. Christ is a sensuous being with a sensuous mother and a supersensuous father, and also why the Eucharist is so central to medieval mysticism. You get to eat God and drink his blood. God is orality and enters into one's mouth with a kiss. Madame Guyon, 17th century French mystic, writes, "We must remember that God is all mouth." I think it's a fantastic line, that God is all mouth. These words are taken from a commentary Guyon writes on the most important text for Jewish and Christian mysticism, which turns up also in Sufism, the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. And if this book communicates nothing else than the following, then I'll be happy. Read and reread the Song of Songs. This is where kind of it all begins, the Song of Songs. This is not the place to do justice to the intense eroticism of the Song of Songs, this ancient Near Eastern nuptial drama originally composed in Aramaic. The love described in the song by a young woman, the Shulamite, and a young man is clearly sexual, but it's not sexually explicit. Instead, the song uses a powerful language of agrarian simile. Her belly is like a stack of wheat. Her hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. Her breasts are like two fawns or clusters of grapes. Her abdomen, his abdomen is like a block of ivory. His lips are like roses, and so on. Within Judaism, the song is interpreted allegorically, not as the love between a girl and a boy, but as Israel's love for God and God's love for his chosen people. Within Christianity, the Song of Songs is the mystical book par excellence, where the church, the universal Catholic Church, takes the place of Israel, and the two lovers are transformed into God in the person of Christ, and the soul expressed through the community of the church, Holy Spirit. The song becomes an ode of love between Christ and the soul, and Christian mysticism can be understood as a millennia-long meditation on the meaning of such love. Already in the 3rd century, Origen interprets the song allegorically as an epithalamion, a marriage song, between a bridegroom understood as the Logos, or Christ as the Word of God, and the bride understood as the soul. He insists on the distinction between eros and agape, love and charity, where eroticism becomes chaste and fleshly lust becomes refined love. But in the medieval Christian tradition, everything passes through St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote 86 sermons on the Song of Songs between 1135 and 1153, only reaching verse 4 of chapter 3 of the song. Bernard's sermons are beautiful, subtle, densely layered palimpsests of quotation and allusion, where Bernard allegorizes each sensuous detail in the song, references to fragrance, ointment, myrrh, and aloes, as expressions of the soul's itinerary towards a loving union with Christ. But matters become even more compelling when the effective force of Bernard's sermons on the song authorizes and licenses an entire tradition of medieval mystical interpretation, which is intensely felt and deeply personal. So this tradition of what's called effective piety comes out of the Song of Songs through it's sort of licensed by Bernard's interpretations. But this is where a lot of medieval female writers come into the picture. In Hardewig of Antwerp's Book of Visions, the union with Christ is described in physical terms. Then he came to me and took me completely in his arms and pressed me to him. Then I was externally completely satisfied to the utmost satiation. At that time, I also had for a short while the strength to bear it, but all too soon I lost sight of that beautiful man. One can find echoes of this intensely erotic relationship to Christ in a significant number of fascinating female mystics. Obviously Julian of Norwich, but also Angela of Foligno, Teresa of Avila, down through Madame Guyon and Mary of the Incarnation. But it would be a mistake to think of this eroticism of this tradition of affective piety as uniquely feminine. Building from the Song of Songs, the 14th century English mystic Richard Rolle describes the fire of love, the incendium amoris, in terms of heat, sweetness, and song. The effect of song, sound, and music, especially the Song of Songs, induces a sweetness of love that is felt through physical heat and compared to jewels and gems like topaz. In the spiritual canticle of John of the Cross, the spiritual marriage of Christ and the soul is compared with the kiss that opens the song. John of the Cross says there, I, being alone, kiss you who are alone. Once again, God is all mouth, and when his love flows into us, it is sweeter than wine. In this connection, we could also think of St. Francis with his open, porous, stigmatized body receiving the love of God, or indeed Henry Suzo's identification of himself and Christ as feminine, which is in this book, The Life of the Servant, which is wild stuff. The obvious eroticism of the Song of Songs develops into a complex tradition of affective piety, where the path of the spirit opens through the body, and where Christ is a transfigured mystical body, a material body, a spiritual body, and a political body. Many mystics have a fiercely erotic connection with God through the person of Christ. Think perhaps of the many medieval images of the lactating Christ who feeds us from his breast, or with the blood of his side wound, what Amy Hollywood calls that glorious slit. We'll return to this theme again in chapter 2 with Julian. Yeah. To put it mildly, the gender of Christ is fluid, at once masculine and feminine, neither and both, a most queer God. One of the great virtues of the mystical tradition is that it allows and indeed encourages a more complex topology of sex and gender, of new behaviors and rich potentialities. Adverb 7, the final adverb, aesthetically. To my mind, mysticism is ascetic, not despite its eroticism, but because of it. And this is a line of thinking that's perhaps puzzling for us. I think it should make us puzzle. There is not a contradiction between eros and ascesis, between love or lust and denial or discipline. Rather, there's a relation of complementarity where spiritual discipline permits the possible transfiguration of love. And it's love's transfiguration which is of ultimate importance. This is the reason why I'm sympathetic to the allegorical reading of the Song of Songs that begins with Origin and continues through into the medieval female mystics. What's going on in the song is not some banal literalism which sees it in terms of sex, but a transformation of the carnal, another thinking of the erotic, a distillation, what psychoanalysts would call a sublimation. What is glimpsed here is some other lineament of desire that would allow for other possibilities of enjoyment, even the enjoyment of God. I'm curious about the meaningfulness of asceticism today. That is both the forms of ascetic practice in which people engage, which are legion, yoga, meditation, fasting, various forms of detox, excessive exercise, and compulsive forms of routine following, which was particularly acute during the COVID-19 pandemic, or which we pathologize, anorexia, bulimia, and so on. We're still strongly drawn to the desire for asceticism, it seems to me, but we find the extremity of mystical practice, think of the self-mortification of monks, stylites, hermits, and anchorites, we find it difficult to understand, and its metaphysical demands too rigorous and weighty for our softer, secular souls. For us, the purgation of sin has become a juice detox, and flagellation has become our relation to a bad selfie posted on social media. We're also, I think, deeply puzzled by the way in which mystical practice conceives of the relation between spirit and flesh, mind and body. We have all apparently become holists or monists, where we're all body and body is all that there is. We're endlessly encouraged to listen to our body, let the body do the talking, and keep the score. This would be nice if it were true, but it isn't. We're not identical with our bodies, but rather our experience of ourselves is eccentric, divided from ourselves. Body holism is a new ideological discourse, which is refuted every time we get sick or sit in the dentist's chair, or even better or actually worse, are plagued by hypochondriac symptoms, conversion disorders of the type that have become remarkably widespread, a pandemic of genuinely felt illusion. Mysticism is an attempt to describe another relation to the body, centered around some distinction between spirit and flesh, pneuma and sarkos. Mysticism is about the spiritualization of the flesh and the fleshly incarnate nature of the spirit, and to understand this requires a certain asceticism. We do not coincide with ourselves. Only psychopaths coincide with themselves. With these 7 adverbs, we can begin to approach the strange and compelling phenomenon that is mysticism, although we barely even scratched the surface. At its core, what's driving the whole thing is love. What mysticism offers is an elevation and a transfiguration of love. Its meaning is love. Gleaning the meaning of love's meaning is one of the ambitions of this little book. At the very end of her showings, Julian of Norwich famously writes, and from the time that it was revealed to me, and from the time it was revealed, I desired many times to know in what was our Lord's meaning. And 15 years after and more, I was answered in spiritual understanding. And it was said, what, do you wish to know your Lord's meaning in this thing? Know it well. Love was its meaning. Who reveals it to you? Love. What did he reveal to you? Love. Why does he reveal it to you? For love. Remain in this and you will know more of the same, but you will never know different without end. At that point, I will end. So that's it. Weird
Thank
stuff.
you very much. That was very interesting. And we now have some time for questions and comments from the online audience. Please use the raise hand function if you want to say something, and I'll give the floor to you. Well, while people are thinking, I had a question as a completely non-expert on this topic, but I was intrigued by these 7 adverbs. Are they equally important? How would you relate them to each other? I mean, they seem different. You spent different amounts of time describing them. They seem to relate to different aspects of life and society. So can you say a bit more about the relationship between them?
I mean, I mean, I guess the most important one is, erotically, I mean, the question of love, the Song of Songs, but they're all, I mean, in a sense, they're all, these are 7 adverbs which are all kind of circling around, the matter at hand, the central phenomenon, which can't be addressed directly. I mean, the point I'm making is that if the minute that you start to talk about something like mysticism, then you're captured by the idea, well, what is mysticism? What is it? And how can you prove that? And that's to kind of miss the point. One of the stories I tell early in the book is that the very category of mysticism is an anachronism, right? The mystics didn't think of themselves as mystics. Mysticism is a 17th century term, which becomes more even more widely used in the 18th century, and it's what Kant is trying to oppose in the entire critical project. And then it becomes a kind of a noun about which books can be written in the 19th century. And so it's a modern term, which we then put back onto these medieval figures. So in a sense, there's a real problem with how we even talk about this whole area of concern. So adverbs are a way of kind of circling around that phenomenon. And the other thing I mentioned is that the mysticism as a practical rather than a theoretical matter. It's not a question of a state of belief or the reality of an entity. It's about the practices of the self and the way the self is bound to itself through practices and bound to others. So in a sense, the adverbs have equal weight, but there are different aspects to them, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. Christian Bull, please.
Hey, thank you for that intriguing talk. I was curious about what you seem to make a distinction between noetic and practical as something very separate.
Yeah.
And I think that may certainly go in some cases, but if you get to the Neoplatonists, you can certainly make the point that noetic experience is something very practical, and it's not merely, intellectual, like so often you see it, the translation intellect for nous and so forth, but it's not that for the Neoplatonists and other similar movements. So I was reminded, because I'm working currently with the function of eros in sort of mystical ascent, and I was wondering if you had a look at, in the life of Plotinus, Porphyry states that when he experienced mystical union 4 times, he says, he used the techniques outlined by Plato in his Symposium. And of course, Symposium is something you don't mention here, which is sort of the great speech about love. And clearly, at least in the circle around Plotinus, they see this as outlining a sort of spiritual practice of noetic ascent driven by love. Love is the engine there.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And yes, I mean, I do not give the Neoplatonic tradition its due importance, and I don't really account for that in what I've said. I tend to, I think, be a bit cheaply suspicious of it, because. But the point you make about the noetic and the practical, that's absolutely right. It's why I'm emphasizing the practical dimension is that it's very often the case that discussions of mysticism can't even get started because people just get blocked on these theoretical issues. Mm-hmm. Is there a God? Is there not a God? Is the soul immortal? Is it not immortal? And these are questions that philosophers like to ask because they're a bit stupid, for the most part, when it comes to intellectual history. And they have the arrogance of believing that they can sit in their armchairs and decide, what's important and what's not, having not read much at all. So it's an attempt to say, well, the way in which we can, we have to think about mysticism as a practical matter, as a network of practices, and that network of practices can lead to composition. It can lead to the composition of a text, which can be a religious text, which now looks to us mystical. And indeed, this is, I mean, the book is overwhelmingly Christian, right? And I have a very kind of agonized relationship with Christianity, but it's Christianity that I want to focus on. So the Neoplatonism doesn't really fit my story, but I know that that's a deeply inadequate answer, because Plotinus is a hugely important figure, and the way in which the Neoplatonic schools functioned, and also it would be a question of at least partially historically of putting together the story of the Neoplatonic schools in Alexandria, and then what happens with the emergence of the monastic tradition in Antony. What's going on in that shift from late Neoplatonism into early monastic thought, and that's also a political issue. And Athanasius, as you know, was a very political figure, and so Plato, Symposium, absolutely. The idea that we're now a little bit more tolerant of the idea of philosophy as a way of life, and a way of life that is described in dialogue, and in particular in dialogues like the Symposium. Yeah, that's a really important part of the story. And here would be a difference. Here, I guess a difference with so when in someone like Plotinus, you get the idea of movement towards the one, ascent towards the one, as a kind of metaphysical ascent towards the one beyond being, which is it's moving from that to the way that's picked up by someone like Meister Eckhart, where that oneness becomes more like the orientation of the self towards the world. It looks much more, so Eckhart, from my perspective, looks much more existential and Heideggerian, if you like, than the Neoplatonic. But you can't ignore that tradition, and I think I owe you a better explanation than that. But that's a beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more question, if anyone. Jorunn Økland, please.
Hi, thank you for that. I was intrigued by what you said about the female medieval mystics, and especially Julian of Norwich. And you talked about her as an author of the text. Now, many colleagues point out either that she didn't write this herself, it was dictated by an editor who could write more or less whatever he wanted, or that it was her confessor who more or less just made up everything and she didn't even know about the book. And, you know, you have the whole range. I mean, these are familiar discussions from many fields. So, but I was just intrigued about what you said about the queer God and all of this. Would it make a difference to this text if Julian had something to do with it, or whether it was a complete literary work just described to her?
Good question. It's a good question. It's a good question. I don't have a good answer, but I mean, I'm teaching Shakespeare this semester for my sins, and you know, you begin to, and I've been gorging myself on books on Shakespeare just to kind of get back in that frame of mind. And of course, the question there is, you know, we always want to tie the work to the life, and we're not satisfied unless there's a connection between the work and the life. And so people will willfully invent whatever stories they want to invent about who Shakespeare was, what he did, you know, his illegitimate children, his relationship with his wife, you know, his relationship to Catholicism, and so on and so forth. And it's and certainly with Julian, you know, one feels that it feels to us like an intensely personal vision, although she's very short on autobiographical, you know, or she's very selective about what autobiographical elements she uses. And of course, there are other female mystics like Marjorie Kemp and many others that use a lot more of that than Julian does. And a number of things to say. I mean, firstly, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to say, well, if you're interested in, say, questions of gender and philosophy, then and the way that normally gets argued about is in terms of, you know, who's in the canon, you know, of modern philosophy and who counts and who doesn't count. But if you just switch focus and you look at this mystical tradition, you find that, you know, the question here, we have a tradition which is to a great extent written by women or written on behalf of women, and where the men in that tradition are engaged in quite strange, you know, to our eyes, quite strange forms of religious devotion in relationship to a God who is very hard to figure out in terms of gender. There is a complexity to the gender of Christ, to say the least. He is a most queer God. So I think it can't help but matter whether she actually wrote it or not. This is a naive assumption. So when I'm reading Julian, it feels to me like she's speaking to me, but of course it could have been composed, it could have been dictated. I don't mind that, actually. I'm very pro dictation in a way. I don't think, you know, it's arguable that Plato didn't write anything, or that Aristotle certainly didn't write anything, you know, so the idea of dictating something as being inauthentic just says something about our modern ideas of what authorship should involve. But I think that if you look at the short text of Julian and the long text of Julian, which as far as we can tell, are separated by some decades, then what you get in Julian's long text is this intensely original theological development of themes which are not there in the short text. So it feels as if this is not just a report on an anchorite in Norwich written by a scribe. It feels that this is the fruit of someone's long and engaged reflection, but there's no evidence for that. I mean, I can't prove that, as you know. It's just an assertion of a feeling. And for me, I want to emphasize very much Julian's theological novelty. So in a sense, the importance of Julian for me is the way mystics have often been talked about, I mean, brilliantly by people like Caroline Bynum, who I'm very, deep admiration for her work, is in experiential terms. And I think that it plays down the fact that what's going on in Julian is conceptual, it's theological, that she's giving us a new picture of the fall and sin and redemption, which is at least an update on what we standardly get in the history of Christianity. Don't know if that answers your question. I don't have another question because it's a good question.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our hour. So I'd like, on behalf of the Academy, to thank Professor Critchley for his highly intriguing lecture, and thank all of you for coming to this online event. And next year, we can hopefully welcome you back to the Academy building in person. That's certainly our goal. So thank you very much for showing up, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.